far northeastern edge of Nottinghamshire, where the county's green rolling landscape is already beginning to give way to the flat open spaces of neighbouring Lincolnshire, is a pretty market town of around 21,000 people. It's just 3 miles from the busy A1 and stands astride the pleasant meanderings of the River Idle. Yet for all that, it's a place that some people seem somehow to overlook. Apart from being more than just a pleasant place to visit, there are many historic aspects to this town that other, larger and more self-important communities can only aspire to. People across the world know the story of the Pilgrim Fathers, but how many even in Nottinghamshire know that they started their journey near here before making the long voyage to America? The infamous highwayman Dick Turpin had particular reason to frequent one of the town's oldest inns, while Buckingham Palace and the Flying Scotsman locomotive both have enviable links to this modest and unassuming town. The name of the place I've been describing is Retford, and over the next half hour or so I'd like you to accompany me as we delve behind the facade of this fascinating town to discover the truth about one of Nottinghamshire's best kept secrets. Join me, Simon Groom, as we discover Retford. The market has always been at the centre of Retford life, and as such seems the ideal place to begin our story of this historic town. Much has changed since this photograph of an Edwardian market day was taken. Conversely, compared to many similar-sized towns across England, very little has changed. If the people we see in these pictures suddenly found themselves in today's market square, they'd find their surroundings perhaps rather strange, but nevertheless surprisingly familiar. The market square we know today was laid out in the late 18th century, partly as a result of the rerouting of the Great North Road through the town. 100 years ago, Market Day would have seen this beautiful square transformed into a hive of activity as people came to buy, sell, browse, greet acquaintances, or simply take in the atmosphere of a typically English market. Today, the produce on offer may be slightly different, but the hurly-burly that transforms this square on market days is little different from that experienced by our forefathers. Admittedly, at today's markets and fairs, there are no cattle being auctioned in front of what is now the NatWest Bank. There are no horses lining Grove Street, and the farm labourers are no longer waiting patiently in line for work. For all that, Market Day in Retford has changed little over the ages. Then, as now on market days, you had to look hard to find the broad stone just outside the town hall. The stone was probably the base of an old parish boundary cross, the Domini cross, moved to the market square in the early 1800s. Tradition has it that during the plague years of 1558 and 1664, the hollow in the stone was filled with vinegar, and coins for trading were immersed in it as a way of preventing the spread of disease. The most significant building in the market square is the town hall. Described as Victorian Romanesque, it was built in 1868 by Thomas Hopkinson, a well-known Retford contractor. This was despite a public outcry against a £9,000 mortgage taken out to meet the cost of the new building and land. 100% mortgages, it seems, are not a new invention. The town hall was built to replace a Georgian town hall on the northeast side of the square. The project involved the construction of a new town hall with corn, butter and meat markets. With the look of a French chateau, the building has been variously described as noble and not unimpressive. The ballroom is certainly impressive, as is the council chamber with its splendid fireplace, portraits and candelabra from the old town hall. The opening of the new town hall was celebrated with a dinner on the 21st of January 1868, followed 2 days later by a grand ball, obviously for the local dignitaries. Now, in contrast, it's available for weddings and public use. The old bank next door has a fine 1888 terracotta frontage and the old town coat of arms above the porch corner on an original Georgian building. There are 4 fine buildings on the west side, most of which began as private residences. The NatWest Bank is in a splendid building of about 1840. The bank manager and his family used to live above the bank. An archway in the northwest corner bears the legend J.P. Esquire 1841. In Latin there is no J, so I is used. John Parker lived in the building now occupied by Stanley Hunt Jewellers, and through the archway were his gardens running down to the River Idle. You'll see on the front of the house metal brackets fixed to the top and bottom. Creepers were grown along wires stretched between these to enhance the appearance of the building. In 1828, 19 stagecoaches a day clattered over the cobbles of the White Hart Inn. The first licence had been granted to a William Riley in 1731, but the inn really came into its own when the Great North Road was brought conveniently past its doors in 1766. The White Hart is also the setting for Retford's most famous ghost story. In the late 18th century, a young girl playing in the yard was accidentally crushed by a heavy stagecoach. Sadly, she died of her injuries just a few hours later. To this day, the ghostly figure of a girl dressed in period clothes is seen playing around the courtyard. It's said that people who've witnessed the apparition are initially quite amused as they assume it's a girl in fancy dress. Their amusement, however, quickly turns to terror when the girl simply vanishes in front of their eyes. A bust was made as a memorial to the girl and was placed high above the main bar in the White Hart. The girl's father took her death extremely badly, and in his grief he placed a curse upon the statue with the warning that if anyone took the bust from the hotel, then death would surely follow. Needless to say, the present hostelry staff are extremely careful not to touch it. Amongst the White Hart's better-known clientele is rumoured to have been Dick Turpin. It's claimed he would sit quietly in a corner of the bar, sizing up the travellers before riding off on his famous horse Black Bess to ambush them on Barnby Moor. In the White Hart yard, time in hand, the clockmakers now occupy what were the inn's stables. Far from adapting the premises to suit their new use, the company have adapted themselves to the premises and simply carry out their daily work from within the stable stalls and feeding racks. Also in the yard can still be seen the old mounting block. This very old photograph shows the old town hall seen from the market square. The hall stood where the roundabout is now situated and was demolished in 1868 when it became inadequate for the council's growing needs. The building was largely financed by the Duke of Newcastle and was said to be the handsomest building in the borough. This photograph shows the actual demolition of the town hall. The cupola has been lowered and can clearly be seen resting on the courtroom floor. Its demolition eased traffic congestion, allowed the market more space, and opened up splendid vistas towards its replacement. There's a terrible irony attached to this photograph taken of the Sherwood Rangers parade in the market square. The date is August 11th, 1914. And the men were about to deposit their colours in the East Retford church until the end of the war. They're standing in front of a central lamppost which was later replaced by the War Memorial marked with the distances to the First World War battle sites. Tragically, one that would carry most of their names. Alongside the town hall is Town Hall Yard, site of the old butter market, which is now used as an indoor Saturday market. This passageway is closed by the council every Christmas Day in order to prevent it from becoming a public right-of-way. This 1970 photograph shows the Corn Exchange, Fire Station and Shambles buildings on Exchange Street. The street, named after the Corn Exchange, is now the site of the monthly farmers' market. The 1930s courthouse was built to take courts previously held in what is now the chairman's room at the town hall. Carrollgate, or Car Hill Gate as it was originally known, was once part of the Great North Road that came into Retford from the south. Travelling in those days must have been thirsty work because along this stretch were no fewer than 11 inns. In fact, so desirable was this area of town that the buildings here were tall and narrow in order that the maximum number could be fitted into the space available. Another indication of the area's importance as a commercial centre can still be seen high on an alley wall at the junction of Exchange Street and Carrollgate. This pawnbroker's sign from the early part of the 19th century reflects the period when pawnbroking played an important part in the everyday economy of towns across England. While the pavement panel featuring fruit and vegetables on Carrollgate may encourage people to keep their eyes on the ground, the premises above their heads are also worthy of attention. These shops have been added onto elegant Georgian houses. The terrace of 3 houses on the far corner had gardens where the shops have now been built. In the background is the recently restored majestic theatre. Tucked away between Carrollgate and Exchange Street, the Majestic is one of Retford's little gems. Built in 1927, the Majestic has in recent times been forced to close twice, once in 1983 and again in 1992. Early 1996 saw the start of renovation by a small team of dedicated volunteers. A few years later, the theatre presented its first show for many years and happily shows no sign of faltering. In its time, the Majestic has been both a cinema and a bingo hall. However, in spite of its somewhat precarious existence and long periods of closure, the interior of the theatre has retained all the glory of its heyday. The trust that now owns the building describe it as very much a living theatre, and whether you sit in the stalls or tread the hallowed boards, their aim is to provide a top-class service. It currently features a huge mix of entertainment and will, they're sure, continue to do so for many years to come. Close to here are 3 panels set into the pavement, each representing one of Retford's twin towns: Aurillac in France, Pfungstadt in Germany, and Farmers Branch in Texas, USA. Bacon's shop, which is also close by, was for many years William Losby's, Gentleman's Outfitters, hence the initials WL high upon the frontage. Back in Grove Street, the gable of the Abbey Bank provides some brickwork that's definitely worth a second look. These bricks are laid to form a triangular pattern known as tumbling, a technique borrowed from the Dutch. Close by is a group of attractive Georgian terraced houses, complete with their original wrought iron balconies and bow windows. If you look carefully, you can see that the bricks have been shaped to make each bow an integral part of the house, rather than being added afterwards. 100 years ago, the streets of Retford would have been nowhere as clean as they are today, especially in winter, a fact borne out by the cast iron boot scrapers designed to remove mud and muck from footwear before entering the house. The flower mosaic at first floor level decorates the frontage of the premises occupied by Clark Dyers for 50 years up to 1908. Hezekiah Clark, an out-of-work dyer, had set up his own business in 1798, which went on to achieve a national reputation. This wonderful photograph shows the skirt finishing section at Clark's Hallcroft Works in 1908. In the foreground of this photograph, taken the same year, is a lady working on a steam-heated cylinder for finishing bedspreads, blinds and other flat items after dyeing and dry cleaning. Even in those days, the paperwork still had to be done, and this photograph shows both male and female typists hard at work in the Clark's office. Local furniture manufacturer Edward Swannock, who established his business in Retford in 1885, occupied number 23 Grove Street. This photograph shows his staff outside the premises in about 1900. And here we see the same building as it is today. Next to the job centre on Grove Street is Poplar House. This beautiful Georgian property is one of the oldest residential houses in Retford and fortunately still retains its garden. At one point in its history, it's believed to have been whitewashed and known as White Hall. In 1730, the house was sold to a widow by the name of Gertrude Woolby for the princely sum of £100. Part of the front section of the house was added in the mid-18th century. At that time, the first floor contained the drawing room and main bedrooms, while the second floor was probably reserved for children and maids. One very interesting feature of the house are the roof slates from the Lake District. Graduated in size with the largest closest to the street, the result is a slight change in perspective, making the roof appear slightly deeper and more pleasing to the eye. Still on Grove Street, the Turk's Head is a really splendid example of a traditional town pub, complete with mock Tudor frontage. The Tourist Information Centre also has its little-known secrets. This building once housed a World War II air raid shelter. Next door is one of Retford's finest Georgian houses, Amcott House, now the Bassett Law Museum. Although situated in town, the house was essentially a country villa with a spacious garden that extended from Beardsall Row to a point just beyond the ring road. Inside there are fine ornamental plasterwork ceilings and an attractive wrought iron staircase. From the 1870s it was the home of the Pegler family, founders of the Northern Rubber Works. Alan Pegler was at one time the owner of the Flying Scotsman locomotive and was responsible for the restoration that saved one of Britain's best-loved icons from the scrapyard. By a strange quirk of circumstances, a former Flying Scotsman has an earlier and more tragic link with the town. In 1923, while travelling south from Doncaster, the train collided with a goods train at Retford. The accident happened next to West Car Road, about 300 yards north of the station. The express had been travelling at about 60 miles an hour, resulting in the tender being tossed completely over the wrecked engine. Sadly, 3 Doncaster men on the footplate were instantly killed. Evidence at the time suggested that the train had passed 5 signals at danger. On the opposite side of the ring road and past St Swithin's Primary School is Gashouse Bridge, which spans the Chesterfield Canal. Unsurprisingly, the bridge takes its name from the gasworks that stood nearby from 1831 until it was partially destroyed by a bomb dropped from a German Zeppelin during the First World War. A little further along the canal is Grove Mills. Built in 1838, it's been used as a malt kiln and a flour mill. The building curves with the canal, and behind it are the remains of its wharf. Most canal traffic was freight, but passengers would also embark for Gainsborough Market and later for Sunday school narrowboat trips. This early photograph shows it complete with a not very attractive extension. In more recent years this has been demolished and the main buildings converted into apartments and a snooker hall, uses that the mill's earlier hard-working occupants would scarcely have been able to comprehend. It was near Grove Mills in 1978 that a workman clearing the canal of debris came across a large metal chain and decided to pull it out. The chain was attached to a plug intended for draining the canal, and the water quickly flowed away. The event made worldwide news. Another and even more magnificent building is the Grove Street Chapel, which stands on the corner of Union Street. Its impressive facade stands as a mute testimony to the wealth and determination of Retford's Wesleyan Methodists. No less than the architects of the Town Hall were then commissioned to produce something even more grandiose and in keeping with their social and economic status. Looking carefully, you'll see how its false front gable is much taller than the actual roof in order to make the building even more impressive. The front steps also help enhance the effect, at the same time accommodating the fact that the entire church is built on a platform so that the interior slopes towards the pulpit. Interestingly, the Methodist teaching was brought to Retford by John MacFarland, a Scottish navvy digging out the canal. Yet another example of how these waterways help touch communities in the most unexpected of ways. Further along Union Street is a row of early 19th century buildings, including one with an interesting original bow window. The story goes that York Castle Museum tried to persuade the owner to part with the window for their famous street display. Fortunately for Retford, the request fell on deaf ears. On the opposite side of Union Street are corporation almshouses. Built in 1825, they were originally for women only. Before the arrival of the Great North Road, Chapelgate was one of the major routes into town. Chapelgate House was built in 1758 and in 1865 became Retford's first public dispensary, providing medicines and treatments to the poor. Later, the house next door was converted into a small cottage hospital with just 3 beds and a cot. The first grammar school was built on the north side of Chapelgate near the Vicarage Garden. It was rebuilt on the same site in 1779, with further additions in 1797 and 1810. Later, a 6-acre site was obtained on London Road, with the new building completed there in 1857. The school can trace its history back to 1551, when a royal charter was granted after a petition by local inhabitants. This impressive photograph shows the new King Edward VI Grammar School of 1857, designed by Decimus Burton, one of the leading architects of the day. Although originally intended for about 120 boys, numbers were distinctly down during the early days at the new site, and by 1886 we're told that there were just 33 pupils attending. A little further down Chapelgate stands the Cloisters, a large impressive house built in 1876. Originally known as the Avenue, it's described as one of the most interesting Victorian houses in Retford. St Swithin's was founded in the 12th century and is the parish church of East Retford. Sadly, in 1651 the tower collapsed and in doing so destroyed much of the original building. Most of what we see today is in fact a Victorian restoration. For all that, there are still some interesting things to be seen inside. In the north transept, for instance, which is the oldest part, there are some 14th century arches that were discovered when the Chantry Chapel was rebuilt in 1873. Thanks to the later restoration, the church also has some fine Victorian stained glass by Clayton and Bell, O'Connor and Kemp. In the chapel in the south transept can be seen Kemp's trademark of a wheat sheaf in the glass. There are also fragments of original medieval glass in the penny window. For those with a keen eye, there's a lady in stone wearing a wimple, which as everyone will know is the veil worn by nuns that covers the neck, chin and sides of the face. There's also a roof boss bearing the town's coat of arms, and another with an angel playing a musical instrument. The church's lectern is reputed to have been carved out of an oak beam from a nearby cotton mill. Opposite the west door of the church at numbers 25 to 27 Churchgate is Sloswick's Hospital. Richard Sloswick died in 1657 and in his will left money to found almshouses for the maintenance of 6 poor old men of good carriage and behaviour to the end of the world. Unfortunately, there was only enough money to support 3 poor old men. On the wall next to the almshouses, above the solicitor's practice, are a couple of easily missed items that are worth making the effort to spot. Fixed to the wall on either side of the central window are 2 fire marks of the Sun Insurance Company. In the 18th and 19th century, if a building caught fire, plates such as these were instant confirmation to the arriving fire brigade that the owners were insured to have them extinguish the fire. Without one of these, the firefighters of the day would have declined to take any action. Next door to the almshouses and set back from the road is Retford's public library. It used to be home to the Denmans, one of Retford's oldest families. Nearby, the Vine Inn was once popular with carriers. The carrier's lot was a strenuous and often part-time operation, and the service was usually designed to coincide with market days. At the end of Churchgate are Burton's Butchers. Burton's are without doubt the oldest butchers in Retford. The business was started here in 1876 and is still owned and run by the 5th generation of the same family. No prizes for guessing why this area is called Cannon Square. This lovely old photograph from 1904 shows a quieter Retford without the noise of modern traffic, although you'd better mind the horse muck. The Cannon, a 2-ton, 24-pounder dating from 1831, was captured by British forces from the Russians at the Battle of Sebastopol in 1855. It was brought to Retford at the suggestion of John Shadrach Piercy, a local historian, schoolmaster and journalist, to commemorate victory in the Crimean War. Piercy, it seems, had been very moved by accounts of the war that he'd received in letters written home by his soldier son. The Cannon, its transportation was paid for by public subscription, arrived in the town by rail from London in April 1858. The problem was that when it did arrive, everyone had different ideas as to where it should be placed. The arguments raged fiercely for nearly a year, until with much ceremony it was named Earl of Aberdeen after the former Prime Minister and placed in its present position. The Cannon was restored to its former glory by the Retford Civic Society in 2006. Opposite Cannon Square are 2 ancient inns. Ye Old Sun Inn dates from the 16th century and has a narrow upper storey, windows against the eaves, a steeply sloping roof and lath and plaster walls, all of which are evidence that it's actually a timber frame building. It was originally a private house until 1750 when it became an inn. The Old Sun Inn is one of the few buildings that survived the disastrous fires that ravaged the town in 1528, 1585 and 1631. The second inn in Cannon Square was the Crown Inn, now called the Litten Tree. Built in 1754, it was the town's premier hotel and first posting house to be built in Retford. It replaced an earlier Crown Inn on the same site. A few years after it had opened as a posting inn, the Great North Road was diverted through the town, something that benefited most of the other rival hotels. The Crown used to be the preferred meeting place of the gentry and the Whigs, and was the scene of great mob violence during the elections of 1774 and 1826, when its windows were stoned before troops were finally brought in. Close to Cannon Square and the town centre is the line of the Great North Road, a highway that had such a great influence on the town and its prosperity. Just to the right of the White Hart is Bridgegate. This narrow roadway was the Great North Road, or A1, from 1766 right up to the 1960s. Thankfully, these days the congestion has gone, providing a quiet enough moment to notice the carved wooden porch over a previous entrance to the White Hart. Bridgegate Mews, a little further along, was created from Bettison's Yard, a row of Georgian cottages once owned by the Bettison family, who were basket makers and coopers. A water tank was discovered under the floor of one of the houses and may have been used to soak strips of willow prior to them being woven. In the 18th century, John Souter made felt hats here, and later number 16A Bridgegate became the town's post office. This is the bridge that gives Bridgegate its name. It also marks the boundary between what in bygone years used to be the communities of East and West Retford. Fittingly, just alongside this spot is the place that in all likelihood Retford takes its own name from. Looking from the bridge, just beyond the building on the left, is the site of the original river crossing, the ford over Red Rock, from which the name Retford is almost certainly derived. The river here was dredged in 1988, revealing the remains of timbers dating back to medieval times. It's known that this was the location for a succession of mills, the earliest of which was said to be one dating from 1086, belonging to the king who granted it to Welbeck Abbey. In later years, other mills housed a variety of trades vital to Retford's economy. Corn grinding, paper making and sailcloth manufacturers were all located here. However, after severe flooding in 1880, the buildings were gradually demolished. This place also provides another interesting illustration of how trades and businesses are often responsible for local place names. The area behind where the mills would have stood is known as Tenter Flat Back Lane, and was the place where cloth was stretched on tenterhooks, a phrase which is often used to describe someone's feeling of anxiety and fearful anticipation. On the path alongside the riverbank used to be the site of something that would most definitely have produced feelings of anxiety. This was where Retford's less well-behaved townsfolk were introduced to the ducking stool, something that could be described as the medieval equivalent of an asbo, but probably more effective. Retford's King's Park, just a few months after completion. The park was opened on June the 29th, 1938, to commemorate both the reign of King George V and also the coronation of King George VI. Mrs. Huntsman of West Retford Hall donated the land, and the park was laid out at a cost of between £7,000 and £8,000, with a public subscription raising £2,000. The grounds provided a bowling green, 3 hard tennis courts, a pavilion, lawns, rock gardens with running water, a rustic bridge and fountain, and a special section for children with an open-air gymnasium. The park is still well used today and provides a wonderful green space within the town. Now let's return to Bridgegate. Many of the buildings on Bridgegate carry the letters TH entwined together. TH refers to Trinity Hospital, a foundation that at one time owned most of West Retford. Another illustration of everyday life in bygone Retford is a plaque set into the wall opposite number 29 Bridgegate. In no uncertain terms, it states that this wall is the property of the rector, June 1858. Apparently this was erected after a dispute between Trinity Hospital and West Retford Church. So now you know. Number 35 Bridgegate has an unusual Edwardian advertisement for Rowland's Band, patronised by the nobility. Close by is the Newcastle Arms, another of the Great North Road's Georgian coaching inns. Nearby Crown House is set back from the road and is private property. Those fortunate enough to have visited the house will have noticed that beside the door are some unusual King Edward VII coronation tiles dating from 1902. Notice the eccentric towers in the style of Watson Fothergill, who was a notable Nottingham architect. This was the Mermaid Inn, now renamed the Galway Arms. In the 1840s, the yard behind the pub had some of the worst slums the Public Health Commissioner had ever seen. Even today, it doesn't take much imagination to visualise the horror, not to mention the smell, of 21 tenements with open cesspools, privies and even a piggery. Ah, the good old days. Traces of the tenement walls are still just visible in the car park, but fortunately the smell no longer lingers. Beyond and upwind of the Galway Arms is a slightly sober-looking terrace of Victorian almshouses. The area is Scholarship Yard, so called because even to this day the rents from the adjoining property enable a local student to attend Oxford University. The more learned visitor has the opportunity to read the details described in Latin on a plaque above the almshouses. The first reference to the parish church of West Retford, or St Michael's as it's better known, occurs as far back as 1227, when Thomas de Carleton and Robert de Bougetame were installed as joint rectors. The elegant spire is unusual in North Nottinghamshire and has been described as a poem in stone, and was built from the plans of the great Victorian architect Pugin. One of the most obvious details on its spire are the small stone protrusions known as crockets. These are purely ornamental and are intended to prevent the spire from appearing to be concave. The church's flying buttresses are unusual, and the large three-ribbed porch dating from the 14th century is also very rare. But it's Retford's ancient gargoyle on the north aisle that fascinates most visitors. Known as the brother who looks over West Retford, it represents George Daddy Parkin, an ex-shoemaker from Worksop, who spent his last years as a brother of Trinity Hospital. As one might expect, St Michael's has a long and fascinating history, much of it reflecting the creditable efforts of former rectors, church officials and parishioners to ensure its survival to the present day. And whilst much of the building can be traced back to medieval times, a great deal of the interior is the result of extensive renovations made by the Victorians. Also of interest on Rectory Road is Gill Hall, complete with small dovecote and the entrance to West Retford Hall. Tucked away on the side of the road near here is an old milestone from the West Retford Turnpike. This pristine street scene shows the Baptist Chapel on Hospital Road, sometime around the turn of the century. This particular chapel dates from 1872 and replaced earlier chapels on the site. The Baptists have a long association with the Retford area. In the late Victorian era, local Baptists were required to follow a strict code of personal conduct. Large numbers of would-be worshippers were excluded for immoral activities. Little seems to have changed at Trinity Hospital since it was photographed by Edgar Welshman on a summer's day in 1900. The hospital was founded in 1665 by Dr. John Darrell, who bequeathed money to found a hospital for 16 Christian men at his home at West Retford Manor. As a result of the increase in land value, the hospital soon became very wealthy, and to this day land agents still administer the estate. In 1833, the original manor was replaced with the splendid building we see today. It was designed by Edward Blore, a nationally known architect. We could be forgiven for feeling that the building has something of a regal flavour. Amongst his other commissions, Blore redesigned Lambeth Palace, planned exteriors for Sir Walter Scott, and even tinkered with Buckingham Palace after the dismissal of John Nash. The central section of the building, which includes the enormous perpendicular window that dominates the first floor, was remodelled in 1872. Beyond that window is the audit room, where on Trinity Day all the accounts are examined and approved and a great feast is held. In earlier times, this feast, which followed the passing of the accounts, is reputed to have lasted for 3 whole days. Records of 1786 show that on one such occasion the 10 brethren of the time consumed 24 pounds of beef, and 11 pounds of veal, accompanied by copious amounts of rum, gin and brandy, all of which cost the princely sum of £2 10 shillings, or £2 50 in today's money. They certainly knew how to party in Retford. Like many Midland towns, Retford's canal has played an important role in both commerce and pleasure, as this delightful Edwardian photograph shows. The gentleman and 3 ladies, all in their Sunday best, are taking a trip just above Woodcock's Bridge. Protestant Place can be seen on the left, and the houses on Babworth Road are on the right. In 1777, the Chesterfield Canal was opened, bringing increased prosperity to the town. All goods carried by water were brought here to Corporation Wharf. The building is the original warehouse that the corporation erected. All bridges over the canal have names. This is Woodcock's Bridge that I mentioned earlier. Woodcock owned the Boat Inn, which has long since disappeared. But it was from a wharf near here that Victorians of Retford were able to enjoy the popular pastime of boating on the town's canal and river. This is Inkerman Bridge, named after a famous battle of the Crimean War. The canals were used to transport all types of cargo, including cannonballs, and it was here in more recent times that a number were recovered from the bottom of the canal. Even the stone used in building the Houses of Parliament passed through Retford, and between 1840 and 1844, 110 tons of Anston stone passed through the town. In Victorian times, this beautifully converted warehouse used to belong to the Fletchers, a family who owned furniture shops in Carrolgate. It's here that the canal widens to form a basin where goods could be loaded and unloaded, and also to provide a place where the boats could turn. At this point, the canal rises much higher than ground level and crosses the river on an aqueduct. Today we can be forgiven for taking such examples of engineering for granted. What we should remember, however, is that, far from being equipped with all the benefits of modern technology, the men who built the canals did so with picks, shovels, wheelbarrows and unimaginably hard physical work. Although highways such as the Great North Road established towns such as Retford firmly on the map, it was the canals and eventually the railways that brought the wealth and prosperity that allowed them to develop into the flourishing communities we know today. For that reason, it's probably fitting that we complete our discovery of Retford with images from an artery that was initially intended to transport goods and materials for the town's emerging industries, but now provides townsfolk with today's rarest of commodities: peace, tranquility, and the ability simply to escape.